Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Spear, and I'm both a linguist and teacher by training. By profession, I'm an assistant professor of English and linguistics at Florida A&M University and an invited professor of linguistics at Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador. As a continuation of the workshop on special education through the Maestría en Enseñanza de Inglés como Segundo Idioma, I'm thrilled today to have the opportunity to speak with Mr. Max Rubinstein, who currently works as a Tier 3 reading interventionist at Woodbridge Township School District in New Jersey. He has worked for 6 years in the field of special education, and one of these years was spent as my co-teacher at an urban middle school, also in New Jersey. So without further ado, welcome, Mr. Rubinstein. How are you doing today?
Very good. Thank you for inviting me to be here.
Of course, I'm pleased to be able to have a conversation with you, particularly because, as our viewers might not know, we did, of course, teach together during COVID, and we've never actually met in person.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Right? So it's a continuation of our virtual relationship here. I'm curious, though, just to get started here, particularly because our viewers don't know yet who you are. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about yourself, who you are, where you're from, what and where you studied?
Sure. So like you said, I'm Max Rubinstein. I went to school in SUNY Albany in New York. While I was there, I got my master's in special ed and literacy. I stayed there for my master's, but I went there as my undergrad as well. Studied history was my main component. I always knew I wanted to be, some kind of teacher. I thought, originally I was like, oh, let me try criminal justice. Loved it. I love law, all that stuff. But it's pretty in depth and it's difficult. So as I kind of transitioned, I was like, you know what? I always loved history. I always, maybe try doing that route. And as I was, deciding what age level I wanted to become a teacher, as I was talking to friends and family, a lot of people said to me, there are no male teachers in elementary school. Mm-hmm. So I said, you know what, let's try to make it a little bit easier for me to try to get a job. Let's try to elementary school. And that's what I did. So I was very fortunate to get a job right out of school. I've had many jobs as I was moved around a bunch of different districts. I've worked in the City School District of Albany for about 4 years in various positions, various schools. Moved to New Jersey where, like you said, we worked in Newark. And for the last 2 years, I have been working in Woodbridge School District as a reading coach. A little bit about myself, 33 years old, married to my beautiful wife. We just had a baby not too long ago. She's 8 months. She's amazing. Absolutely love her to death already. She makes me smile with just sitting there. She can make me smile.
Oh, that's beautiful. You mean your wife, your child, or both?
Both.
I was going to say, you don't want to get into hot water.
Just in case she, listens to this or watches this video, I want to make sure.
That was a safe answer. Excellent. So you mentioned that you were studying history. So how in the world did you and I end up teaching English language arts together?
So, it's one of those things. Once I realized I wanted to become an ELA teacher, or I'm sorry, a elementary school teacher. For history, you can't, those classroom teachers, they just teach everything. Okay. So as, that transitioned kind of working out, it kind of just worked out where history wasn't, they're not going to, in elementary school, you're not going to just be a history teacher. You're going to be a classroom teacher and you're going to teach history. And as it kind of transitioned, I always knew I wanted to help with special ed and, work students that have difficulties, but I didn't know how. And I know, history is probably not going to get me there. So, I'm sure we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I struggled as a reader. And I was like, you know what? I want to help students who were like me when I was younger. And it kind of just pushed me towards that path. So ELA became the way to do it.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I think that that's another one of those really difficult decisions that teachers oftentimes have to make. See, for me, my question, as you said, there aren't a whole heck of a lot of male teachers in primary school. For me, I couldn't recall having a lot of male English teachers. And so for me, that was one of the defining pushes. And during my undergraduate education, I found that I was often the only or one of the only two guys in the classroom. And so it's interesting how those sorts of situations arise. Um, you mentioned, and we can probably come back to this in a little bit, but you mentioned that perhaps a possible impetus for your interest in working with students with disabilities of any kind might actually spring from this experience you had yourself. So, how long have you actually been teaching students with disabilities of any kind, of any severity? And what do you think are maybe some of the biggest misconceptions about teaching special ed?
So I was kind of thinking about that. I've been teaching, I think, for 10 years. And I think of those 10 years, I would say seven of those 7 years have been teaching special ed of some kind, whether it's been co-teaching in the classroom, whether it's been a reading teacher to pull out, whether I've been working as even a TA in a special ed room. I've done all these kinds of experiences. And from those, different classrooms, different, ways of how teachers have taught, one of the biggest misconceptions that I think, and we talked about this before, is the label is a
Okay.
big misconception. Like I said, when I was younger, I had a reading disability. Um, I was worried, and a lot of these parents are worried that, or even these students are worried that they're going to have this label for the rest of their life.
Mhm.
No, that is something that I learned, as a student, something that I learned now as a teacher. That does not follow you. Okay, it can. I'm not going to say it doesn't, but it's something that doesn't have to follow you. Okay, we want to focus on students getting the services they need, the support they need, and we're going to base it off what they need, not off a label. Whether it's a classification or a disability, we want to base it off what they need. So I think the biggest thing that is a huge misconception is this label of being special ed and the
Okay.
fact that it's going to stay with them. Another big thing that I also learned, and I was also very hesitant when I went to get my master's in special ed, was
Mhm.
that being a special ed teacher or being a special ed student, you're in a separate classroom way down the hall, you know, by yourself, and there's 8 kids and 6 teachers, and that's it. Okay. And, I can tell you maybe in the 1950s, that's the way it was. But now, with this push in new education systems and everything like that, not the case, at all. I mean, there's this whole big thing for I think it's called LRE, least restrictive environment, I
Mhm.
believe it's called, where, we want these kids all together, in an inclusion classroom where even if a kid is considered special ed with some kind of disability, they should be in a classroom full of students with no disability. And if they need some kind of services, they're pulled out. Or, in other cases, teachers are pushed in where they're getting the support they need in front of all the teachers.
Okay.
Okay. Another service that they get, speech. Speech is something that they can be pulled out for a half an hour and then they're back in. We want these kids in the classroom with everybody, with the full population for a large majority of the day. And I knew going into, or at least I thought going into, learning and, being taught about special ed, that
Mhm.
this was the case. Once you were special ed, you were in a classroom from kindergarten through 12th grade in high school. You were going to be in this classroom by yourself with kids that were just like you, and that was it. And that's totally, totally not the case. So that was a very big eye-opening experience for me once I realized there are so many different types of special ed settings out there that it's very, very different.
You're exactly right. And I'm going to push you a little bit here because with one of our other participants, who is a teacher of students with visual impairments, I had asked a question that was somewhat provocative or aggressive. And I'm actually going to ask you the same question because for many of our viewers who are currently teachers in Ecuador or teachers in training, they're working in or will be working in schools where special education still, in many cases, follows this segregationist model where students are completely separate. They might be in the same building. Oftentimes they're not. They might actually be at a completely different school. But the question I have for you is, if you have a student, for instance, when we worked together, we had quite a few students who needed additional scaffolding, additional one-on-one support, or as close to one-on-one support as they could get in that environment. What would you say to a parent of, let's say, a typically functioning child who says, if you have those kids in the room at the same time, it takes away from the attention that my child needs?
Well, so it's one of those things, in education now, it's all that everybody, education for all is like that big initiative. And, I think, you know, it's definitely a concern for parents where they think their, angel, I'm going to put that nicely, is not going to get everything they need because we're going to be distracted or we're going to have all our attention focused on the one student. And there's something that I learned in education is there's a difference between what you need, and I'm trying to think of the terminology. I think it's, everything is, it's not always going to be fair, but it's going to be equal, or it's
Okay.
going to be what you need. I'm trying to think of the term. Basically, it means just because this student over here may need the additional support and you don't, that shouldn't say like, oh, I need, how come I don't have that? Or that's not fair. You're distracting me
Mhm.
from, learning. It's what students are needing. So everybody's individualized.
Mhm.
So, a parent that may be upset that, my student is not getting the same thing, or my student is not, um, you know, being helped, or is not, getting everything that their one student is needing, they don't need that. That's not something that they need. So I think that, the main focus should be on what every student needs and how we can support them in any way that they see fit.
Right. I think that's a fantastic way of wording it. I always sort of conceptualize it like a race. I have a twin brother, and he always had an IEP when he went through primary and secondary school. Probably much like you, as you were suggesting, for a learning disability related to reading comprehension. And so he many times was, pulled out when he had to take a test so that he could be in an environment that was quieter and free of distractions and so forth. And those kinds of accommodations, or perhaps a modification of an assignment, is not necessarily, of course, giving a student with any kind of disability or any special needs an advantage, but instead trying to level the playing field so that if they were doing a race, that you don't have the student with a learning disability always starting from behind, but instead they're starting at the same point.
Right. There's this motivational poster. Um, and again, it has three kids of all different heights and three boxes of all different heights. And it's basically saying if you give these three kids who are different heights the same level boxes, it's going to do nothing, because the smaller child, if he gets the same box that the tallest kid is going to get, it's going to do nothing. Okay, but if you give that small child a box that's a little bit bigger to put them on the same even playing field as all the other ones, now you have something here. You're giving them not an advantage, you're giving them on the equal playing field where everybody's able to get the same thing that everybody needs.
Right. So equity versus equality.
Yes,
So we don't all get a pair of shoes, but we get the pair of shoes that fits us appropriately if we need a pair of shoes.
right.
Excellent. Cool. So shifting gears a little bit here, what does a typical day look like for you in the classroom? What do you think is difficult? What is pretty straightforward? And how do you manage personally the responsibilities either of co-teaching or of being responsible for primary instruction?
So my typical day is a pull-out model. So I will go to classrooms and I will gather kids up. They will come back to my classroom and we will do a 20 or 30-minute lesson on a skill, or something that these students have a difficulty in. It may not align with what they're doing in their classroom because these students may not be up to that level. I have a lot of teachers, and I work with a lot of first graders who are doing, writing, for example, writing a paragraph. the students that I'm working with are probably, if I can get them writing a sentence, I'm going to do that. I'm going to start there. So my students may be working first on making sure they capitalize the first letter of every sentence and making sure they focus on a period. Whereas if they go back to their classroom, they're probably not going to worry about that. Okay.
Right.
So they're always, unfortunately, those students are always going to be behind. But if I can keep them, try to catch them up, that's what I'm going to do. So maybe we'll get to that, writing that one paragraph, but we may not get to it at the same pace as that. So yeah, no, that's kind of my typical day. I will pull kids. I'll have about, anywhere from 8 to 9 groups, about, 3 to 5 students in each group. Preferably that's usually about, what my day consists of. Some of the things that are a lot easier is, I would say, kind of using, the data that is able to kind of show me and show the classroom teacher which students I'm going to take, which ones are going to, what skills we're going to work on, what deficiencies they have, where I can say, okay, on this assessment, this student did not do well. So for the first 6 weeks of school, we're going to focus on this. Then we're going to test them again, and we're going to see if they are good to go, and maybe they can stay in the classroom. They don't have to be pulled out, or maybe they need additional support. So, I use data as like a huge point to drive where my lessons are going to go. And that's something that is, it's straightforward. It really is something that can't be, argued with, because I can say, it says right here, this is what it says. Something that is a little more difficult, I would say, is finding the time to be able to pull the kids out. I do get a lot of, not as much, but there is sometimes a lot of pushback with teachers on when I can pull students out.
Okay.
With students who have difficulties in school, oftentimes they get pulled out for multiple things, whether it be for speech, whether it be for OT or PT, whether, different things like that. So, I get it from a teacher standpoint. They don't want to be pulled out 2 or 3 times a day. And, that is, definitely unfortunate for those homeroom teachers, because, they're the ones that are responsible for the grades. They're the ones that are getting, responsible for those assessments, those, state tests as the kids get older. So, part of me, I do get it, but kind of like what we talked about before, these students clearly need these services. So, I don't want to say like whatever I say goes, but we're doing this to help, these students so they do perform better in your classroom. So it's never a point where, I've been told a couple times where I have, been told by a teacher, no, you cannot take this student right now, and it gets to the point where, they say to me, well, why don't you wait, can you wait 10 minutes? And then I'll send them down. And oftentimes 10 minutes turns into 20 minutes, 20 minutes turns into 30 minutes, and then I have to move on. Unfortunately, I have other responsibilities where, this is not my only student, so I have to move on. So there are times in my day where I do not see students or a student because that teacher chose not to send him to me. It is what it is, in the grand scheme of things, one day out of, 180. But again, it's one more skill or one more lesson that student didn't get that he can benefit from. So I would definitely say that's a big difficulty with me. And we kind of brought all that up, like that managing it is, there are some, like we talked about, positives, negatives of being able to, work together. But, I consider myself someone very easygoing, where, I am able to balance what I have to do with all the thousands of things that a classroom teacher has to do. So I kind of give them the benefit of the doubt, and I say, okay, if today doesn't work, that's fine. I like I said, I have other kids, I can move on, and I could say, what, if it doesn't work now, if I have time, maybe I'll come back and get them and do maybe a quick little 10 or 15-minute lesson. If it's one-on-one, it can be a little bit easier. So I'm a lot more easygoing, where I know these teachers have a lot, to do, where I'm going to try to make their life easier. And whatever that means for them is, something that, can be done. Another responsibility that we have to do together is all these assessments. And,
Mhm.
I don't know how it is in Ecuador, and maybe you could talk to me a little bit more about this. The testing that students have to do, especially in elementary school, especially in first grade, is insane. We've started, it's day 2 for us. These students have, I would say, probably 3 or 4 assessments they need to do before the end of September. And that is very much absolutely insane.
Mhm.
And it doesn't slow down. Um, so, that's another thing that we have to balance our responsibilities with, getting their reading level, doing a start strong where they have to see what they lost over the summer, kind of seeing what they will be teaching over the summer. And so assessments are another big component of my responsibilities in my job.
Well, and I remember the assessments in particular when we were at Newark because we invested about a week at the very start of the year just on testing. I mean, there was no instruction done. This seems to be something far more widespread in the United States than anywhere else.
Mhm.
Um, but as you were describing the responsibilities of your everyday tasks here, it seems like you need to be in regular communication with a lot of classroom teachers a lot of the time.
Yes. I mean, constant. Like there are in the school that I'm in this year, there are 4 first grade teachers,
Okay.
which is my main component. But if I have the time and if I have the ability to, I go into second grade as well. So that's 4 additional teachers. I have to also communicate with the speech teacher to make sure I'm not pulling them out during their speech time. The principal wants to know the social work, and there's just a lot of it's constant communication.
Okay. And when you mentioned that if the students were all staying in their, let's say, regular classroom, I don't, there's something wrong, of course, with the way that that sounds, but in
Homeroom,
their regular
homeroom.
classroom
We call it
during,
homeroom classroom.
okay, so if the students were to stay in their homeroom classroom for the duration of instruction, the teacher might be working on something that the students simply aren't prepared for, as you mentioned. And so
Mhm.
you try to focus on skills and building on top of those skills that that these students have developed, in particular with you. But does this mean that you look at the lesson plans for those homeroom teachers and sort of tailor it? Or how do you actually determine your own instruction?
So I kind of badmouthed it a little bit, but I do use a lot of the assessment data.
Okay.
That's so the way my position works is these first few days of school, I do a lot of observations where I will go into the first grade classrooms and I will just sit there. I won't say anything to the students. I won't say anything to the teachers. I just want to see if I can pick up on anything that kids are saying, that any kind of behaviors that I notice of a student maybe having difficulties doing. For example, today, a student said to another student, how do I write? I forgot how to write a J.
Hmm.
What do I do with how do I write a capital J? So in first grade, that's like definitely like a red flag to me. Like a student, in first grade, I would think should be able to know how to write a capital J. Okay. It's things like that in the first couple of days where I don't have groups yet because I won't know my students who are low. I just kind of pick up on some things. Other things that I do is I look at data from the previous year. So I look at how these kindergartners ended the year on their reading level. So at the end of first grade, we want students reading at a level D.
Hmm.
So as I was looking at the data of all these first graders, I looked at which students are reading at anything lower than a D. And I'm saying, okay, these are students that I'm going to have to kind of keep an eye on.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe these are students who I may have, maybe they grew over the summer. Okay. We won't know until we test them again, in September. So
Hmm.
that's more of what I'm going to look at. And then finally, we have another assessment called Link It, which is it's a big test, a computer-based test where it tests them on sight words, it tests them on comprehension, their reading, it tests them on a lot of different skills that first graders should have.
Okay.
And based off that, I'll look at which students did not do well. And I'll say, okay, from this, which students did also not have a good reading level, did not do well on, did I observe them saying something, and then I'll say, okay, these are my groups. Okay, I'll know which kids I'm going to have. And then I myself, as a reading teacher, have my own assessment. And I do my own assessments based off first grade skills, kindergarten skills, and that tells me where I should start. So for example, on the kindergarten skills, something as basic as knowing the alphabet.
Mhm.
Do they know the alphabet? Do they know what letters are vowels? Do they know what letters are consonants? Do they know the order of the alphabet? And this tells me, okay, this student didn't know that. He's going to go in this group. This student, while he knows the alphabet, he may not know how to put the sounds together to make words. He's going to go in this group. So it gives me the information I need to kind of tell me how the years, how these groups are going to go. And the good thing about it is it's fluid. So if a student starts out low, he could have just had a bad day. He's going to accelerate, and he could even not only jump grade level, or I'm sorry, groups, but he could say, oh, this kid is great. He just had a bad day. I don't even have to see him. And he's good to go back into the classroom.
Okay.
So it kind of, that's what I use. I use that data. I said it before. I know there's a lot of it, but because there's so much, I can pull things from everywhere to kind of say which students I need and where I should start.
That's really interesting. And I know that for legal and ethical reasons, we can't talk about any of your students, current or past, but I'm curious, in your experience over these last 10 years and the 6 or 7 in special ed, have you found that the students with whom you work are perhaps also affected by a secondary disability in addition to the learning disability? That is to say, do you typically only have students with maybe issues in reading comprehension, or might you also have students with an issue in reading comprehension who might also have cerebral palsy or some sort of mental illness, or perhaps being on the autism spectrum?
I would say I see a lot. I see a lot.
Okay.
It's a very broad, kind of question, just because with it, yes, they could have something as simple as not something simple, but they could have a learning disability. And that could be the reason why I'm seeing them, why they're having these difficulties in reading.
Okay.
But yes, they could have something where they could have ADHD, which keeps them from focusing, which means they can't, they have trouble just putting three letters together to be able to make a word because they're having trouble focusing.
Right.
They'll get one letter sound correct, but then they'll lose their focus to be able to get the second sound and then putting it together to blend. So I see a lot of in my line of work, I see a lot of ADHD. I do see a few some autism as well, but I think that's kind of where my line ends. I think once they go into different disabilities, maybe a little bit more severe, like you said, cerebral palsy, that's kind of where my line kind of ends. So I see a lot of students that, their biggest disability would be a learning disability, maybe ADHD.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah, it's always a topic that has, fascinated me, because before you and I taught together and the students would leave to work with you separately, the last school where I had taught, and it had been a couple years before then, I would have an aide in the classroom who was certified as a special ed teacher, but she would be in the classroom all day, every day with me, working with set students across each of those classes. Now, this was, of course, secondary school, so high school
Mm.
students, and she would not pull them out. She would, unless they had to take a test, in which case things would be modified. But we were, for all intents and purposes, constructing lessons together as equal teachers, because her students were my students and my students were her students, such that there wasn't necessarily that divide between, special ed and typical ed.
Right. And we kind of did it that way when we did work together in Newark,
Yeah.
and that is definitely like a good co-teach model where, it's one of those things where, they don't need, like we talked about before, they don't need to be labeled as special ed to get services. Every student needs a little extra help.
Mhm.
You don't have to call them special ed because they need, a direction repeated, for example, which, that could be an accommodation that a special ed student will get, directions, reread.
Mhm.
Every student who is 10, 11, 12 could look out the window for a quick second and say, oh, I missed the directions. Can I get that again? That's something very basic. I mean, I was very fortunate enough my first or second year in Albany when I was a TA, a teaching assistant in a special ed room. Um, it was a 16-1-1. So it was one teacher, one TA, and then 16 students.
Okay.
Um, it was an LD classroom. I believe that's what they classified it as a learning disability classroom. But there was a lot going on where I don't think it was classified correctly. But that teacher, and this was also after I graduated, so I was a fully certified special ed literacy, teacher. She didn't treat me as a TA. She treated me as a co-teacher. So I learned a lot on how to make lesson plans. I learned a lot on co-teaching. I learned a lot on some of the behind the scenes stuff in teaching that, I had a great experience in Albany, but they don't teach teachers the behind the scenes stuff of what actually goes on in teaching.
It's really interesting that you say that, because I have one final question here for you, and it's a perfect segue. So you said they don't teach teachers about this sort of behind the scenes. So I'm going to ask you to do that, right? If you could offer a class or a workshop to current teachers or teachers in training, perhaps about teaching in general, maybe about special education specifically, what kind of tips or advice would you offer?
So first of all, I don't know what you would call it, but if we could teach incoming teachers the politics behind teaching, it would be amazing, because as a teacher, there is so much more that you do as a teacher than just be a teacher.
Mhm.
Because, as much as I love being a teacher, the the hoops and some of the things you need to jump through and jump over just to make sure you are doing what you're supposed to do is pretty crazy. And I wish someone told me the paperwork that needs to be done, how to better prepare me to make lesson plans. Not so, if I'm spoiling anything for anybody, I was taught how to make a full 6-page lesson plan. Nobody wants to see those,
Right.
because as teachers, we don't have time for that, which is great. But I wish in college, in your master's programs, I want to know what it's like to be a teacher, what it's really like to be a teacher. I want to know, of course, I want to know the curriculums, all these things on how to become a teacher,
Mhm.
behavior management, but I want to also know kind of the nitty gritty that they won't teach you. But I want that to be a class. I want the politics of teaching and kind of the behind the scenes stuff. I think it would be great. I think that would be great. Um, Tips though for teachers, I think the biggest thing, and I think it really helped me, um, classroom environment, behavior management. You want to build that rapport with your students. My first 2 years of teaching, I was a substitute, and as a substitute, if I did not have good behavior management, I was going to get eaten alive,
Mhm.
because these kids don't know who I am. They are going to think, oh, you're not my real teacher. I'm going to do crazy things. And if you don't have a lockdown on how to handle students when they're acting up, you're going to have a problem. So I think having that experience as a substitute, being pushed in on day one, and, you know, just being pushed into the fire, basically, you need to make sure you know how to handle students when they act up, and that behavior management is key. And I think while it's different now as I'm working with first graders, because for the most part, these first graders are pretty, they're still afraid of me, which I have to tell you, I love when students are afraid of me. But I was working in middle school for a few years. These sixth, seventh, eighth graders, they are not going to look at you and probably be afraid of you.
Right.
So you need to make sure that you have behavior management. And I think that is a key component. Now, on top of that, building that rapport with students to create that class culture where they feel comfortable to come into your classroom, where they can share things if something's going wrong, that's key. Okay, so you kind of got to be, that you want them to know that you're a good guy, but you want them to know, or a good girl, but you want them to know that you are caring and you're understanding and you're, you know, willing to listen to them. Like, one of the things about me is I love to have fun. I love to smile. I love to joke
Mhm.
around, but my students know when it's time to work, we're going to work. You'll know when it's time for fun and time to play, but we're going to work when we're going to work. And my students know that about me.
I love that you say that because I remember, some of our shared students, it was, Mr. Rubinstein is the fun, nice guy, and Dr. Spears the serious. We got to do all of our work. We have all this to get through, kind of stern person. It's a very nice combination, I think, of the two of us. And I really love here that you mentioned rapport because a lot of the advice you gave, in the same way that you were talking about differentiated instruction earlier, it all applies to all students.
Yes.
So one adaptation in the classroom, sure, it may have been motivated by a desire to help students with disabilities, but it doesn't mean it won't help everyone.
100%.
Building a fun, safe, but also rigorous and educational environment helps all students. And of course, it helps you as well because you can establish that dynamic. You can be friendly, but not friends.
Right. And that's definitely, the biggest thing. And, in specifically for special ed, we talk about making goals, for yourself, for your students. Specifically in special ed, you want to make goals that these students can reach, that are attainable. You want them to be challenging, but you want to make sure that they're attainable, they're realistic and they're able to get. So another like advice specifically for special ed, and I mean, this goes for a lot of teachers, but thinking about special ed, make goals, make, things when you're setting smart goals or, anything like that for your students, make them realistic, something that they can actually attain and challenge it.
Excellent. That sounds great. And I feel like if I had made my SMART goals for this conversation, I would have hit them all. So I just want to take a second here to thank you again, Mr. Rubenstein, for taking the time to speak with me today. It's been a while since I've seen your lovely face, but it's been such a pleasure. So on behalf of the viewers and myself, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Happy to be here.